Let's see, Stacy, Danny, Carrie. You guys got special now. We're just going to start doing special music like that every week. Just pick random people that don't know their own. Hey, if it turns out like that, we'll be in good shape, won't we? I absolutely love ice cream. This particular flavor is a good flavor I recommend. It's called Drumstick. It's made by Edie's. And there's nothing more I like to have than ice cream to eat. It's probably my favorite thing to eat. It has been 4 weeks since I've had ice cream. This is not a sermon on temptation. But it's starting to look like it might be coming. I don't know if you like ice cream or not. Raise your hand if you like ice cream. If you didn't raise your hand, you can go ahead and exit. No, please stay. You probably can relate. Maybe it's not ice cream, but maybe you had something else. My favorite new thing they've come out with is Breyers makes this gelato. It's called Indulgences. And maybe you remember the commercial. It has the parents eating the gelato ice cream, and they say it's not for kids, and they're hiding it from their kids. My wife and I do that, actually. And we say, kids can't eat this ice cream. It's for adults only because it's so good. And it's named Indulgences, which is such a great name for ice cream and such a great name for this sermon and for this illustration. Well, ice cream is a very delicious thing. I love to eat it. I could eat and eat and eat ice cream. In fact, when I eat ice cream, this is about how much I eat every time. Well, it used to be about a month ago when I quit eating sugars. But we'll see how long that lasts. But when I get done eating ice cream, especially if it's good ice cream, and I've hardly met an ice cream that's not good, but when I get done eating ice cream, here's what typically happens. I know this sounds really, really horrible, but when I get done eating ice cream, I want to eat more ice cream. I know that sounds awful, even when I get a big bowl like that, but I love eating ice cream so much that I just can't get enough. Bring me a bucket of it. I'm ready. And it was really, really difficult. I should have brought a video to play. This weekend we were in Tulsa and we went to this place. It was called the Freezing Cow. And they took this kind of like I guess it must have been some sort of form of liquid nitrogen or whatever, freezing top countertop, and they spread this, it looks like chocolate milk out all over it, and it begins to freeze up, and they kind of hibachi style chop it, and then it freezes, and then they scrape it, and it rolls up into these rolls. And it was the coolest thing I've ever seen, and I didn't get to eat it. And it was a really great exercise in self-discipline for me. But I really could just eat it all the time. And I think that's a perfect illustration for me of what kind of a world I live in. I have it so nice that I can go get ice cream anytime I need it, and when I run out, I can go get more, and I can have as much as I want to have of it, because that's the kind of world I live in. I have that kind of privilege, I have that kind of access to so many good things. And if you're like, wait, you preached this sermon last week, hang on a little bit, because it's not about the comfortable world that I live in. That's not what this sermon is about. But just as an illustration of what happens to us when we can live in this kind of world where we can have access to all kinds of things that bring us joy, or a better word is actually pleasure. Because we have all kinds of cravings. And maybe it's not ice cream, maybe it's steak, maybe it's something that's not a food at all that you crave, maybe it's other people's attention, maybe it's for other people to like you. I'm not sure what it is, but we all have these desires and cravings that we're longing to have filled in our hearts and our minds and who we are. And we live in such a world that can happen pretty easily for us because we don't have it really very difficult here. So it's pretty easy to chase after our pleasures and our desires and the things that we do crave. Because that's the world we live in. I think it creates some things that we need to be aware of. And so today I really want to talk about how we navigate somewhat through this world and what that means for us as we think about open doors and we think about what kinds of doors we're going to walk through. There's this great thing that a long time ago became kind of common in America. It was that you should chase after your dreams. And I think I've told my kids that. You were probably told that when you were a kid. And all of us have been taught in this country to dream big. And if you put your mind to it and you work hard enough, you can do anything. And while we see a lot of cases where that can come true, and we know exactly what that really means, because we've been taught to chase our dreams, sometimes in the world we live in now, we can find out that we're actually chasing after a false reality. And here's what I'm talking about. It's called Facebook. It's called social media. It's called Instagram. It's called Twitter. In the world that we live in, you and I instantly have access to see everyone else's life. And when we see everyone else's life, we create this false sense of reality. Because you know what everyone plays on their social media? It's their highlight reel. It's the highlight reel of their life. Most of the time, people are not posting things on social media to say, look how awful my day was. These are all the bad things I did. This is how terrible I looked whenever I went to work. People don't do this kind of thing. Now, if they do that kind of thing, it typically is to draw attention to themselves and say, oh, poor you, whenever they post things like that. So we have this weird dichotomy going on of reality. We know what it is, but we see other people's highlight reels all the time, and then we start to think this. My life is not that good. I mean, look at their life. They're going on these amazing vacations. They look fabulous all the time. I don't know, it's probably every 2 minutes I'm out in society today. About every 2 minutes I see somebody taking a selfie. And when I see that happening, it's always like, getting everything just right, and the angle just right, and the lighting just right, because they want to capture everything just right. And we don't really get a sense of what reality really is anymore, because we can actually get wrapped up into chasing after everybody else's highlight reel. And if you're on social media long enough, you will end up depressed. Because there's this phenomenon, and Sherry Turkle deemed it. She's a professor at MIT. She deemed it this: FOMO. This is a phenomenon that's happening right now. Fear of missing out. FOMO. And it's hitting us hard if we're wrapped up in that world. Now listen, you don't even have to be on social media to have this happen to you. You can just see someone else's truck, or see someone else's house, or hear a story from a coworker about their vacation they had, or some exciting thing that happened in their life. You don't just have to be online to see this, but we have this big thing called FOMO right now, fear of missing out, because we're looking at everything else that's happening in everybody else's life, and we're like, oh, I think I'm missing out on something. Mindy Kaling, she wrote a book, and the title of the book was this: Is Everyone Else Hanging Out Without Me? And it's meant to be funny, and it's supposed to be a funny book, but the title is exactly what we're talking about. The idea that somehow we missed out on something that someone else got to do. And that is reaching and grabbing a hold of us, and it's easily happening because it's actually not new. It actually goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden. Do you know why we actually have this great fear of missing out, a lot of us? Why we think maybe we're missing something? Why I can eat a bowl of ice cream and then want more? It's because deep down I'm actually created for more. And the devil loves to play off of that need and that desire that we have. It happened in the garden. Genesis chapter 3, it was that early. Do you remember the words? I quote him a lot. I wish I didn't have to, but it's an amazing reminder for us. Satan says to Adam and Eve, did God really say that you can't eat from that tree? And it was wrapped into that lie. God doesn't want you to eat from that tree, because if you eat from that tree, you're going to get something that right now you're missing out on. And that lie has been wrapped into every way our indulgences play out in this life today. Because here's what we do. We try to feed the more monster. We have this monster of more inside of us, and we try to feed it with all kinds of things that we think are going to be self-fulfilling. And it turns out, all that makes us want to have is more. If you would, please turn in your Bibles to the book of Ruth. If you're trying to find Ruth, it's very early on in your Bible. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth. She's the eighth book. Ruth is a size 4. She's only 4 chapters long. She's a tiny one, so it might be kind of hard to find her. Very few pages are in this book. It's a little narrative that we find, a story of this woman named Ruth, aptly named the book here. And we're going to start in chapter 1. We're not going to read the entire book and the entire story, but we're going to kind of walk down through these verses this morning and look at the story of Ruth. And as we look at this story, we're actually going to see some people facing open doors. And the open doors that we face, we're talking this whole series about doors that God opens for us. But you know, there are actually other doors that we can walk through that we want to open for ourselves. And this is what happens in this story. Ways that we can go to actually do what we want to do versus doing what God would want us to do. And it might be strange, you're like, why are we in this book of Ruth to find this? Well, hopefully as we go along, you can start to see the lights come on with this story. Let's look at Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled. Okay, we'll stop there. And the days when the judges ruled. That's a pretty big statement. You kind of need to know what timeline we're talking about here. If you want to find out what this means and what this timeline and when we're talking about in history, all you've got to do is look on the other page of your Bible there. Mine's laid out where Judges ends here, Ruth starts here. So all you got to do is look back to the very last verse of Judges chapter 21, verse 25. And here's what that one verse says. It's the theme of the whole book of Judges. It says this: in those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. If you want to know the theme of the entire book of Judges, if you want to sum up the whole timeline that Ruth found herself living in, everyone did as he saw fit. Kind of sounds like now, doesn't it? And so that's why this book works really well for us, because it's not that much different. And I don't want you to miss either, Israel had no king. Now this is not actually true. They had a king. His name was God. But that wasn't good enough for him anymore. And the time of the judges, God raised up these men and women to help lead the nation of Israel. And then that time ends. And finally they actually get a real, actual human king. But all of that was because they really didn't want God to be their king. And because they just wanted to do what they saw fit. So here we are, back over to Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. It was in the days the judges ruled. There was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, well, that's a really interesting place. We'll hang on to that. He, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. If you don't know how Moab started, there's a really, really horrible story about Lot. After Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, Lot and his 2 daughters escaped that. Something really bad. Well, it ends up, Lot actually ended up being the grandpa and dad to his own kid. That's a really, really immoral story. Well, that's how the country of Moab begins. I'm sorry, that's rated R, but that's what the Bible tells us about this country of Moab. And so this is the place they go to. From the land of Israel, from the place they're called to live, the promised land, to this place called Moab. The man's name that went to Moab was Elimelech. Excuse me. His wife's name was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Kilion. And they had a pet dog named Bouillon. Sorry, they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah, and they went to Moab and lived there. So you get the scene. There's a famine in Israel, and they're hunting for a new place to live, to find food. It's a pretty simple reason to try to spread out and find survival. So Elimelech heads off with his wife Naomi. They have 2 kids, and they're going to Moab. Now, there's nothing really necessarily wrong with where they're going, but what happens next is where the story kind of turns a little bit for the worse. Verse 3, now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, he died. She was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women. Ruh-roh. If you don't know if that's bad, we need to talk about why that's bad. They married Moabite women. So if you go to Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 3, you'll find out why this is not a good thing. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 3, it actually tells us why them marrying Moabite women wasn't good. It says this: do not intermarry with them. Now it's talking about foreigners, talking about other nations. Do not intermarry with them. These are the laws and words from God. Do not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughters for your sons. So they get to Moab, and they do exactly what God says not to do. They get there, and they intermarry with foreigners. Now, that seems, in our world today, really racist. I get it. it seems like that's really closed-minded. It seems like, well, what's the big deal? They're just people. Everybody's people. We're all equal. And I know it's really hard to understand why God would put up a law like that for his people. But here's why. If they intermarry with the foreign people, with the people from other countries that don't know who God is, but they have all kinds of false gods, then they will start worshiping those false gods. And that's why God set up the rule. I know it may seem weird, it may seem, pretty foreign and pretty mean, but God had a reason. It was a good reason. It was so that they wouldn't be led astray to worship false idols. Well, they lead this life, they marry Moabite women. One was named Ortberg, we're back in verse 4 of Ruth, and the other was named Ruth. After they lived about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Some people in Jewish tradition think the reason these 2 boys died was actually punishment for their sin of intermarrying with people from outside the Israelite nation. And we don't know for sure. God doesn't say that in this text. But like it or not, this is how the story goes. These 2 boys are gone. And now it's just Naomi, and she's got her 2 daughters-in-law who are not Israelite. But you've got to think that over a 10-year period of time, somehow Naomi is probably, along with her sons, tried to teach these new daughters what it means to worship and follow God. Who the God of Israel is, how there is only one God, and how all their false gods that they might have known are not real. So, there's probably influence here, and you can definitely tell as the story goes on. Look at verse 6. When Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. Now, verse 7 is a key open-door moment. With her 2 daughters-in-law, she left the place where she'd been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. So they set out. They're going to go on a journey. And you can see this world and this kind of influence that Naomi has. Her 2 daughters-in-law stick with her. And so they're going to go back on the road. Pick it back up in verse 8. Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, so they're kind of like travelers, she says this, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you've shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud. And they said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I'm too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried to them? No, my daughters. It's more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." So this is all the scene of how Naomi's trying to get the 2 of them to go home. I can't help but think about how you're trying to leave home and your dog just keeps following you. You're like, "No, go back to the house." And it's not like that, but I can't help but think of that in this story of Naomi trying to break away from these 2 girls. And there's lots of reasons why. First of all, she doesn't want to give them false hope. She doesn't want them to think that somehow she's going to provide. And I know it's kind of hard to understand, but then for a woman to really be able to have a good livelihood, they needed to be married, because they had to have that kind of relationship with the husband to help provide for their needs in that world in that time. And so for all 3 of them to be without a husband, and I know in our world it doesn't make as much sense, but in that world, it was everything for them to be married. And so Naomi's trying to dissuade them. And we probably can sense that Ruth and Orpah probably are willing to follow this God, and maybe they are following the God of Israel. And she could probably know this is going to be a real test of your strength to be able to follow in line. I'm going to actually let you off the hook, is what Naomi's saying here. And I know it's kind of strange also. She's like, "Are you going to wait around for me to have more boys? And then when I have more boys, let them grow up so you can then marry them?" And you're like, "What is the deal with that? That's so odd." Well, another verse that might help you a lot is Deuteronomy 25:5. And in this verse, Deuteronomy 25:5, this is what the law told them to do. It says that brothers are living together, and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. You're like, "Wait a minute, that's not the duty of brother-in-laws now, is it?" And like, "No, it's not." But in that time, that was the duty of the brother-in-law. If your brother passed away, it was your duty then to marry his left-behind widow. And then you actually were called to have children with her to continue his family line, because with the family line was the family name. And with the family name was also plots of land and inheritance that came with that. So this is what Naomi is talking about. You can't wait around for me to have more kids. You just need to go on to the life that's much more self-serving for you. And here's a pivotal point in the story, verse 14 of Ruth 1 again. At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye. But Ruth clung to her. There's a difference in the two doors that Orpah and Ruth start to walk through. Now, Orpah turns to go back home. And if you're wondering, by the way, yes, that's how Oprah Winfrey did get her name. It's from this Bible name. Maybe many of you were thinking about that. Her actual name is Orpah on her birth certificate, just no one could pronounce it, so they switched it. So, I know, useless information. But Orpah, she makes the choice to go through a door that, honestly, let's be real. Are any of us in this room going to blame her for going back home? No. I mean, none of us would blame her for that. She's going to go back to her mom's house. She's going to go back to the land she's from. But it's not that simple when you start to think about it. Because actually what she's choosing also here is she's choosing really the God she's going to worship. And I know it might not seem like that at surface level, but if you start to look at what this decision will really mean for her, she's really actually leaving the God of Israel behind for all intents and purposes, for all we know. Because she's going back to what she knew before. And really, she's choosing the path of least resistance here. She's choosing the path of indulgence, of just going back to what's easy, going back to what she likes, going back to what she knows. And as she turns to go that way, Ruth holds on to her. A lot of you might know the book Alice in Wonderland, and you might have read the other book, the prequel to that, and I always kind of butcher the title, but it's Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Saw There, something like that is the title. And in that story, Alice, she looks into a mirror. And as she looks into this mirror, she enters in through this mirror and basically into this mirrored reality, into a house just like hers, except everything is mirrored and it's backwards. So in order to go right, she has to walk to the left. In order to go left, she has to walk to the right. And you might know the Jabberwocky poem that you find in that story. In order to read the Jabberwocky poem, she has to hold up the book to the mirror so that the book can read the right way, so she can read the words of the story. Everything is backwards in the story. And so to get where she wants to go, she has to walk in the opposite direction. And ends up at the end of the story, she's in a chess match with a queen. And she knows that if she can beat the queen, she'll have all the power that she's won. And so as the chess match gets played out, she defeats the queen. And then as she's sitting there in victory, she starts to find out that power seems really petty. That being the winner wasn't really what she wanted. It really didn't satisfy her desire of what she really wants. And then all of a sudden she realizes she's went the wrong direction. As we look at the story of Ruth and we look at the story of Orpah, there is a direction that each of them go. And it seems like Orpah's path seems to be okay, but actually it takes her away from the direction that she really wants to be. It's the easy way. It's a self-serving way that she actually goes, while Ruth clings on to the way that takes her in the right direction. And here's the thing about following Jesus. Oftentimes, when you follow Jesus, you have to walk the opposite direction of what the world will tell you that you have to go. If you're going to follow Jesus, you might think it means to just go along with the rest of the world and I can kind of tack on a little bit of Jesus as I go. But actually to get to the place that you want to wind up going, you've got to walk in the opposite direction that the rest of the world is walking. And in this little story here, Ruth chooses this. She chooses self-sacrifice. Verse 15, back in our story, "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. And when Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. Finally, Ruth gets her mother-in-law to let it go. She's like, I'm not going to leave you. I don't care what you say. I'm going to go wherever you go. I don't care what you do. I'm just going to stick with you. Do you see the bold faith? Do you see the self-sacrifice that Ruth lays down? Because this is not the easy path. This is not the path of indulgence. This is a path of self-sacrifice and self-serving, because Naomi is a lot older than Ruth. And not only is Ruth going to have to figure out how to take care of herself, she's also going to have to figure out how to take care of her mother-in-law, because she sees that as her obligation and duty. Well, we don't have time to read the rest of the story, but if you were to start reading in chapter 2, you'd see this man named Boaz. Boaz happens to be a man who's in the middle of the barley harvest, and that's where Ruth goes, because Naomi says, you're related in a way to him. So she goes and she starts collecting barley. She has enough to feed her. She has enough to feed Naomi. And things keep going well. And finally it comes to the point that there's this kinsman redeemer. And what a kinsman redeemer does, if the brother's not able to marry, then there's somebody else in the family line that's obligated or has the duty, if they so choose, to marry Ruth. And so Boaz finds out that Ruth actually wants to be married to him. And he goes, and there's one guy ahead of him in line. So he goes and he has a conversation with the guy, and he says, hey, if you want to marry Ruth, it's your duty, it's your right. You can have all the land, you can have a family name, you can marry her, but if not, I'd like to have this. And the guy said he didn't want to, so they traded shoes, which is weird, but that's what they did. And then Boaz and Ruth get married, and it's a love story. And to that union was born a son, and his name was Obed. And that son grew up, and he had a son, and his name was Jesse. And that boy grew up to become a man, and he had a lot of sons, and one of them is really, really popular. His name is David. And David became the greatest king in the history of Israel until someday, Micah chapter 5, verse 2 tells us that there's going to be another promise of someone else that's going to come later, someone else that's going to be born later. They call this, Micah chapter 5, verse 2, they call this a messianic prophecy. And if you go and you read Micah 5, you can go ahead and turn there with me. You see the promise. Micah chapter 5, verse 2. But you, Bethlehem, there it is again, Ephrath, which is the same thing as Bethlehem. Though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel, whose origins are from of old, from ancient times. And of course, we know the one that came, that was born. So you see Obed, you see Jesse, you see David, and then you don't see the genealogy until you go read Matthew chapter 1. And then you read the genealogy of this boy named Jesus. Ruth chose the path of self-sacrifice. And because she chose that path, she got to have a blessing that she never imagined, was to actually be in the family line of the one who would come and save the world from their sins, the one that would come and actually be king. See, in those days, Israel had no king. Because it had no king, they had no guidance. Everyone did what they saw fit. So Elimelech and his boys, they haul off to Moab, and they think it's just go ahead and marry the Moabite women because that's convenient. And you know what happens whenever you just do what you think is convenient? You start to just indulge yourself in these things that are indulging. And after you indulge yourself in this ice cream or whatever indulgences you have, you get some, and then as soon as you have some, what you really want is you really want to have more. And as you have more, what you'll really find out is when you're done with that, you just want more. Because that's what the path of self-satisfaction keeps leading you to. Emptiness. Because if all you're going to do in this world is try to chase after every dream and chase after every pleasure that you want, and some of you could raise your hands and testify right now because you've done it. You know when you chase after more in all the self-fulfilling ways and all the self-loving ways that you can give, You know what it ends up with. It ends up with being a mess. Because it doesn't really ever truly fulfill. It doesn't really ever give you what you want. Because what you're longing to fill is never found through a door of self-indulgence. But it's always found through the door of self-sacrifice. Orpah didn't find it, but boy, Ruth did. And through her, we have a son. We have a king. And that king is telling you and I a way to go. He's telling us the way of giving up ourselves to find what we really want. 1957, they made a movie. It was called Bridge on the River Kwai. And it was a movie about POWs that were caught in all kinds of countries in Asia. And they were held in Thailand by their captors, the Japanese. And these Japanese soldiers took these men and they made them work through the thick jungle of Thailand building a railway. They wanted to build this so they could transport materials for a possible invasion into India. And so this movie's about this story, but Philip Yancey interviewed one of the men who was a prisoner in this camp. His name was Ernest Gordon. Ernest Gordon was a British Army officer. He was captured by the Japanese at the age of 24. And he was brought to the camp to begin working on this railway through the jungles of Thailand. And as he describes the scene, he said, every day it was men working as prisoners of war. They were working basically naked, wearing nothing but a loincloth, working in about 120-degree heat. And as they were scorched by the sun, they would often be stung or bitten by insects. And you can just imagine how much they began to really wear out. And if a soldier started lagging behind, oftentimes the Japanese would grab that man and he would take them and they would beat them to death in front of all the other soldiers, possibly bayonet them, maybe decapitate them right then and there. And if they weren't killed by the Japanese soldiers, many men died of dehydration, exhaustion, and other kinds of diseases. They say that about 80,000 men died building that railway. That's 329 for every mile of track. Pretty soon, as Ernest started working in this camp, he felt his own life begin to slip away. He had about 5 or 6 different diseases, and finally he came down with diphtheria, and he wasn't able to even eat his meager ration of rice and water. So he asked to be moved to this place. They called it the death house. The death house is this place where they take those who are about to die, and they just lay these men down on pallets and just basically leave them there. While he was in this death house, something began to happen. There was a story about some men who had been working, and every day they took inventory. They took inventory of the shovels that they took out, and one day the Japanese soldiers counted that one shovel was missing. And so they lined up all the men, and they said, whoever took the shovel, you're going to die, but if nobody confesses, you're all going to die. We're going to execute you all right here. And so as they began to take their rifle and began to aim at the first soldier, one man stepped out of line, and he said, it was me. I took the shovel. They immediately seized that man, and they drug him away, and they beat him to death. The men went off to work, and then later they had another inventory count, and they counted, and they found out that actually there were no shovels missing at all. The Japanese soldiers had made a mistake counting. That man who died hadn't stolen a shovel, hadn't lost a shovel, and they finally all started to realize what he'd done for them. And up until that time in the camp, every man was just fighting for survival. Every man for themselves, wanting to somehow just survive and hopefully get rescued by the Allies. But whenever that happened, when that one man began to do that self-sacrifice, the whole spirit in the camp changed. They said all of a sudden all the men stopped caring about themselves and just themselves, but instead they started really caring about each other. They went and they built a makeshift kind of clinic, and they built a bamboo floor up off the swampland of the Thailand floor they were working on so they could actually help heal up and recuperate these men. So Ernest Gordon himself was lifted and carried over into this clinic. And there they began to nurture him, and they began to share their food with him. They began to heal up his wounds. And Ernest said pretty soon I was recovering, and I couldn't believe that I had actually regained my strength. He said that story of self-sacrifice just swept through the entire camp. The story of self-sacrifice is a story that might be hard for us to get our minds around. But as Philip Yancey says in his book about Ernest Gordon, he says this. This is what Gordon said: "Death was still with us, no doubt about it. We were slowly being freed from its destructive grip, but we began to see the contrast between life and death." He said, "Selfishness, hatred, envy, jealousy, greed, self-indulgence, laziness, and pride, they were all anti-life. But love, heroism, self-sacrifice, sympathy, mercy, integrity, and creative faith were the essence of life. And these were the gifts that God gave to us through that time." In the 1940s, in the POW camp in Thailand, there were two stories. There was one world in that jungle of self-indulgence and self-service, and there became another world of self-sacrifice. That little boy Jesus grew up to be a man. And as he grew up to be a man, came time for this Last Supper together. And as that Last Supper was coming, Jesus, well, he didn't really take a towel, but he took his garment and he got down on the floor and he began to wash these men's feet. The King of the universe got down to serve. And as he took that garment, he began to wipe those dirty feet, clean them up, and when he got done, he said this: "I want you guys to go do the same." And Jesus gets up and he basically hands this towel to each of one of us. And he says, "What I want you to do is go do this. I want you to give up yourself and walk through this door of self-sacrifice." And you know what's funny? Every time I walk through the door of self-indulgence, it never really fulfills me. It always ends up being a mess. But you know what's awesome? The door of self-sacrifice can always clean it up. And Jesus went to a cross because he wanted to take every kind of way that we think we can please ourselves, and he wanted to clean up the mess that we can sometimes make in our lives. And then he asked us to choose that path and that way. So here's the towel of self-sacrifice. Will you choose to take it and walk through that open door? Let's pray. God, forgive all of us for all the ways that we try to find fulfillment, and all the ways that we do that in seeking out our own pleasure. And Lord, I know a lot of us are afraid we're going to miss out. We think that this world's going to pass us by, and somehow we're going to miss out on this grand opportunity. So Lord, give us new eyes to see that the grand opportunity is the door of self-sacrifice, that we have before us every day a chance to see other people and to choose to cling on to them in a way that Ruth clung on to you. Help us to do that. Help us to think about how we can go out of our ways to give up ourselves so that we might be able to be an instrument to clean up the mess that other people might have made of their lives. Help us to extend grace and mercy through actions every single day. Pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
All right, you can all stand. Thank you for being here today. We're going to close by singing a little bit of the song, "Goodness of God."